Revenge of the Buried. In 1819, Dr. Victor Hartmann was a well-known surgeon and anatomist in Edinburgh, but he had an unusual interest in stealing and examining the corpses of the dead. This illegal activity, it would force Hartmann to face vengeance on the souls of the dead. One night, Dr. Hartmann and his assistant Albert sneaked into the local cemetery and began digging up a newly buried body. Dr. Hartmann planned to take the body to medical school for examination, but this time things were different. When they removed the body, Dr. Hartmann and Albert saw that the corpse's eyes were open and the corpse was smiling at them. Horrified, the two wanted to carry the body back to its grave with the intention of burying it quickly, but the corpse suddenly moved and attacked them. The corpse's breath smelled of death, and he bit and injured Hartmann. Fleeing from the cemetery in panic, Dr. Hartmann and Albert went to the hospital and had their injuries treated, but the wounds began to worsen rapidly, and Dr. Hartmann's health began to decline rapidly. Albert started acting like he was crazy. A few days later, Dr. Hartmann and Albert reunited in front of an old church near the cemetery. The door of the church had mysteriously opened, and eerie screams were coming from inside. The two entered the church and saw the corpses coming back to life inside and approaching them. The eyes of the corpses were filled with blank and deathly looks. Dr. Hartmann and Albert were trapped inside the church and watched as the corpses surrounded them. As the corpses reached for them with their hands, Dr. Hartmann and Albert's screams echoed outside the town. After that day, Dr. Hartmann, Albert, and the others never returned. The church and cemetery were deserted, but the ghosts of the corpses still hovered there and continued to seek their vengeance. This event gave rise to the town's frequent sightings of ghosts and gruesome rumors of the return of the Dr. Hartmann and Albert stood trapped inside the church, with no hope of escaping the corpses that surrounded them. The corpses' hands and fingers were skinny and bony, but they had incredible strength. Dr. Hartmann's wounds continued to bleed, and Albert's frantic gaze was etched into his eyes. Suddenly, a corpse approached and studied their faces. His eyes were filled with the coldness of death, and just like the corpse's first attack, this corpse smiled too. Dr. Hartmann and Albert began to advance in a row after the corpse. However, suddenly the corpses were withdrawn and returned to their places. The door of the church closed with a loud noise, trapping the two inside. The inside of the church became quiet, and the silence was even more frightening. Dr. Hartmann and Albert felt trapped. When they averted their eyes, they saw the paintings on the walls of the church come to life. Historical figures and spirits filled the church. Many figures looked like ghosts and were approaching the middle of the church. Dr. Hartmann and Albert were studying these paranormal entities. Suddenly, all the figures swirled around and approached the two. Dr. Hartmann's wounds began to heal suddenly, but this recovery seemed like a dream. In the end, all the figures, they besieged Hartmann and Albert. The two were drawn into the figures and suddenly moved to an unknown dimension. They encountered the coldness and horror of death and were never able to return. The church and cemetery were abandoned, but the effects of the events were still felt. The inhabitants of the town considered this church and cemetery to be cursed, representing the vengeance of ghosts and the returning dead, and still, as he passed through that area, he saw the fluttering ghosts of